Well, Peter Leithart strikes again with a fascinating and surprising reading and interpretation of Genesis 1. Let me tell you more what I thought. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. Okay, I just recently worked through the newest from Peter Leithart, who is a theologian that I follow with some interest, have followed for a while. This work is called Creator, and it's from IVP Academic. I want to say thanks to IVP for sending me this copy. This is my honest take on the book. I'll take you through my typical format of the main idea of the book, the research behind it, the readability, the style, and then my reaction to it in general. So let's dive in. So the main idea of Creator is a really close reading and also a theological interpretation, a theological unpacking of Genesis 1. And that's going to need a little bit of defining, I think, for the prospective reader, because I was pretty surprised about some of the directions this book took. It is not a line-by-line, word-for-word, exegetical, linguistic unpacking or interpretation, so there's not... Yeah, it's not going to be that style. It's also it's theological in its look in terms of like kind of looking at the whole text, not just Genesis 1, but kind of looking at the whole text of Scripture. But it's also theological in that it foregrounds kind of comparison with other theological systems. And one of my surprises in this book was how much discussion of things like Platonism there was. Things like Platonism or things like Aquinas' treatment of creation and doctrine of God. And also a really, really interesting discussion of apophatic approach towards the doctrine of God. Really interesting discussions of certain classical doctrines like divine simplicity. All that stuff is swimming around in this book, and most surprisingly, you don't really get into the text of Genesis 1 until quite late in the book. There are long chapters on a lot of these theological concepts and really in-depth discussions of Platonism, for example. And so that's all in there. I was kind of surprised by it. This wasn't what I was expecting. Now, it was a very pleasant surprise, but it was a surprise. So anyways, I'm getting far off the tangent of the main idea here. The main idea is how can a Protestant theologian, the high view of Scripture, construe a doctrine of God purely from Scripture, namely Genesis 1. And what does that look like? And this is Leithart at kind of his sharpest and most forceful, arguing for a very, very rigorous kind of doctrine of God that comes from the text. And then lots of implications come from that when it comes to other these classical doctrines of God. And it's a lot of the big kind of push and pull here in his doctrine. I'll say more about this in my reaction, and I'll stop the main idea here. A lot of his push and pull in this particular book is kind of situating his doctrine of God between more of a process theology outworking of God and more of a classical doctrine of God. So he's kind of doesn't sit neatly in either of those two camps, so to speak. And that's Creator is kind of his manifesto on doctrine of God according to his take on the text, and as a Protestant. Okay, so that's my attempt to wrangle the main idea that rested on the main idea of Creator. Now let me get through these next couple points. So I already alluded to a lot of this stuff with the research, but I mean, man, oh man, Peter Leithart is such a brilliant, well-read person. I've read a good bit of his work over the years, and this is no exception in terms of his ability to research. And I was really impressed. With his construal of Platonic philosophy, Neoplatonism, kind of classical Greek thought. Man, I thought that was so interesting in this book. I was totally not expecting it at all, but his unpacking of that, his extremely he's just extremely well read and is extremely fluent in those primary sources. I should have been surprised because I've thought very highly of his intellect and his ability to research for a long time. But yeah, I was still surprised. This is really, really good, really strong element of the research. Of course, he's really well versed in the history of theological interpretation as well. There's a really strong discussion of Aquinas and kind of Aquinas's interpretive history here and the impact that's had on the church over the centuries. Also really good discussion of, I mentioned apophaticism. There's also really, really, really good discussion of, history of theological understandings. He brings in process theology, I already mentioned. It's just very remarkably wide-ranging when it comes to the kind of landscape of theological options that are out there. And he brings it all to bear, and it's an amazing when you read a book like this and you just feel like, wow, he's just so well versed in such a wide range of sources. So that's a bit on the research. It brings all of that in. Now the readability. This is a question, because can a work of this caliber, a work of this depth, a work that interacts so much with like Greek, Platonism, can that work? Is that work readable? Well, yes and no. Yes and no. For me, I really enjoyed the reading experience of this book. And what I want to say but I'm going to couch this, I'm going to frame this. It's definitely not for everybody. I could definitely see someone who's looking, they see the title, they see the subtitle, they think, oh, I'm really interested in Genesis, I'm really interested in the creation story. I'd be really interested in seeing what a theologian like Peter Leithart says about that. I could see them being bewildered by the opening chapters on apophaticism and those like deep kind of not tangents but deep kind of tirades on Platonic thought. Like I could just see someone being like, when are we going to get to Genesis here? And I could see that being a really challenging reading experience for some folks. I really love the page-for-page reading experience, though, because I was game for all of those discussions. If you're a prospective reader of this book, if you're a fan of Peter Leithart, I'm kind of trying to give you some context for what it might be to get into this. I loved all of that. And I want to say one more thing about the style. What about the thing of style? So it is very academic. It's extremely well-researched. And it is, the vocabulary of the book, the sentence-for-sentence style is not the most approachable for the uninitiated reader. But the style of Leithart, though, I kept thinking of comparing him to David Bentley Hart. And in some ways I've thought, and this book really kind of cemented this in my mind, I kind of think of Peter Leithart as the Protestant David Bentley Hart in a way. Stylistically, I think that he has this, the two of them, and I also love David Bentley Hart, although I know he's also controversial in his own circles, but there's something about the way that both of them write that's kind of this, it's almost a brash, confident, no-holds-barred style that's extremely learned, very confident and well-researched, that I just find fun to read, even if I could see it rankling some other people, people who hold different views, who maybe feel like their views are just being torn down or ridiculed or something. He doesn't ridicule, he doesn't get in polemics, but he's just very brash and straightforward, and there's kind of this thundering style to the way that he argues and talks, which is a lot like David Bentley Hart. I think he's a little bit less acerbic than David Bentley Hart is, but there's still a comparison there. And so one example is that the way he talks about how in his mind, in Leithart's mind, it is ridiculous to think that accommodationist language is somehow quote-unquote smarter than analogical or metaphorical language for God. So the idea that when Scripture says God is a rock or God is a fortress or something like that, how is that less sophisticated than abstracting that out and then using Platonic forms or ideals to talk about God's immutability or God's timelessness? Like, how is one of those, like, he kind of thunders against this idea that one of those is smarter than the other one, and he just wants to receive the metaphorical, analogical language for God and build a doctrine off of that and kind of cut through all of the dross that's accumulated over tradition and years and centuries, and I read stuff like that and I just think this is great. This is like, I love the kind of lightning bolt clarity of it, and I love even when it does get a little bit like brash. I just find it really enjoyable, and I think that he kind of brings intellectual heft to it that, I don't know, he's almost, writers like him and like David Bentley Hart, I think they kind of earn it, if that makes sense. But not everyone's going to react to that style in that way. I basically loved it, but not everyone's going to react to that. So just know that it's like that going into it. So okay, that's the readability. Hopefully that gives you a sense of what you're getting into with this book. Okay, my reaction. Let's kind of land this plane here. So I really appreciated this book. Given all the couch this in all the stuff I said about the readability and the style and the detours into all these other areas of theological reflection, all of that is here. And that may be a put off for a lot of people. If you're willing to go on that journey, if you're willing to go through all of that, there's a lot that can be gleaned out of this book. If you're looking for a high view of Scripture, really distinctly Protestant doctrine of God that is rooted solidly in the text, that also is conversant with things like process theology and the history of classical theology and kind of the reception of classical thinking about God over the centuries. This is a really remarkable book situated in that way. I very much appreciated his pushback on both of those camps. I thought it was very interesting. I think there's a chapter late in the book called The Metaphysics of Genesis, like how do we build a metaphysic out of Genesis 1. It's really interesting. The discussion of he pushes really hard the discussion of God's relationship to time. How can we build a doctrine of God that has a relation to time, which is a really, really interesting topic to me, and you probably would, if you're interested in that, you would find a lot here to chew on. And then the last thing I'll say, and this is probably the big thing that's just reverberating with me since reading this book, is he really pushes and asks the question that not asks the question, but kind of asserts the premise, the notion that all we can really know of God can be known of God as a creator, because God created and we exist in the creation, and therefore all that can be known about God is kind of through that act. So it starts to push and not sit comfortably. It's not comfortably in process thought, because God is still the one who initiated and created and kind of is outside of that in a sense, but it also doesn't sit neatly in classical thought, which abstracts all of thought and doctrine about God away from stuff and creation. And so he's really trying to push against all of that. And it's fascinating. It's really, really fascinating if you're up for some significant, deep reflection on all the topics I've already spoken through. And I'll end with this. This is apparently the first in a trilogy from Leithart. He says in the intro that this is he's working on a 3-volume work called Creator, Creation, Man. Each volume is going to be one-word titles. And I couldn't be more excited to read what else he's going to come up with. Whatever anthropology he puts forward in the third book, whatever kind of doctrine of creation itself he puts forward, I think it's just going to be, I'm game to read it. It's going to be really exciting to see what he can do, and kind of breathe some fresh wind, breathe some fresh air rather into these conversations with a distinctly Protestant flair in his flair of style. I just think it's going to be great. If you are a Peter Leithart fan, definitely pick this one up. If you're not, I don't know if this is the first one I'd start with from him, but if you're interested in metaphysics and classical doctrine and all that stuff, then and you're interested in especially Plato and Platonic philosophy and the history of how that interacts with Christian thought, I don't know, start with this one. It's going to be a great intro to the world of the world of Peter Leithart's writing. So I've said enough on this book. Really interesting one, worth some time given all those caveats I've mentioned. But thanks as always for taking some time to watch.